When a stranger calls, I worked at a campground on the night shift from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. I would bring in my PS2 game a good portion of the night, only having to deal with 1 or 2 people on busy nights. It was just me in this little 8-foot by 8-foot shack, with nothing around but darkness. My first week there, the other third shift guy who was quitting told me about this payphone a few feet from the shack where I worked. He said it rang every night at 4:17 a.m., just once. It was probably just an automated test call, he guessed. He's never answered it himself. It was the middle of summer, so most nights I had the windows closed, so I couldn't hear the payphone go off. Mid-August I started leaving the windows open during the night. Sure enough, at 4:17 a.m. every morning, the phone would ring once. The ring even sounded creepy, like the payphone was submerged in water. One night I got up the nerve to answer it. I set an alarm at 4:15 a.m. and would go wait at the phone until it rang. When it did, I answered it. But there was no sound. Just dead air, like someone was on the other line but wasn't answering. I said hello a few times and hung up. I did this every night for a week with the same results. I didn't think anything of it and left it alone after that for about a month. The first week of October, I decided to answer the phone once again. I set my alarm, and when the time came, I answered the phone. Hello. Hello. Then I heard what sounded like someone inhaling through clenched teeth. The voice sounded rough and like he had gargled gravel. He said my complete name. First, middle, and last. It was a voice I'd never heard. My voice caught in my throat and I hung up. I rattled some change into the payphone and hit 69. The number had come from California, but I was in Indiana. Stranger tries to blow up family. When I was a kid, we'd go to these beach cabins in Maryland, right by the Chesapeake. They were small and rustic with basic comforts and no amenities. There were 2 bedrooms and a cot in the kitchen, and my siblings and I rotated on the cot. A small tradition was that my mom and I would have a hot cup of tea before bed in our summer jammies, which was our way of relaxing while everyone else went off to read or listen to music. One night I was settling on the cot when she picked up the tea kettle to fill it. Out of the corner of my eye, I see her flinch, then say in a steady voice, "What are you doing there?" My head whipped over to the kitchenette to see her looking out the window. Then she jumped back and started screaming for my father. My dad ran from the back bedroom and saw my mom point towards the left side of the house. He burst out the door. I was 10 years old, so I ran under my parents' bed. I still remember the smell of the old wood and the feel of my teddy bear shielding me from whatever the hell was happening. I remember seeing my 14-year-old brother, who was then a medium-ranking karate student, following my dad out of the cabin at full speed. My father, a former Army sergeant and MP with a Bronze Star, managed to tackle the guy that had been peeping into our kitchen window. He put him in an elbow lock face down on the ground with my brother standing over both of them. While my mom ran to get the cell phone we'd bought just 2 weeks earlier, while my mom called 911, I remember hearing the guy talking. He was saying things like, "The Ouija board told me," and "I want the devil to suck my brains out," and "Satan is in cabin 10, I have to get to cabin 10. The devil wants me to kill myself," and so on. We were in cabin 3, over half a mile from where he apparently intended to meet the devil. My dad kept a grip on him for probably a good 15 minutes until the cops showed up. The first thing out of one of the cops' mouth was, "Jamie, when they let you out?" Jamie had been released from jail just 2 weeks earlier for arson, and guess where he was standing when my mom was at the sink in the kitchen? Right beside the cabin's propane tank. A follower in Amsterdam. Okay, so I spent about 6 months in Europe, mostly alone but meeting up with friends here and there. I went to Amsterdam for a week at the beginning of my trip and 2 weeks at the end. Maybe 2 or 3 days before I was supposed to come back to the US, I planned a lovely day of getting really baked and walking to the enormous and lovely Vondelpark. Before continuing, I'm just going to say that Amsterdam is nothing like the movies. It's beautiful, full of canals, museums, bikers, swans, etc. It's just great, anyway, so I got insanely high and began my trek to the park. On the way, This short dude who looked like a young Steve Buscemi walked past me going the opposite way, and I accidentally made eye contact. He stopped and wanted to talk to me even though I told him I wasn't interested in conversation. Then, he insisted that he walk me to the park to keep me safe. He asked me tons of questions and told me all about himself while I kept insisting that I didn't want to talk and just wanted to go alone to meet my friends. After about a 40-minute walk of hell, we entered the park. I pointed to the nearest building and said I was meeting them inside, said bye, and ran into the building. I was inside sitting to the side of the front door for about 20 minutes when he came inside. He saw me and I saw him, and he quickly ran out the door. At that point, I was really upset that he was following me, and I stayed inside the building for another hour. I peeked outside through a window and saw him, sitting on a bench directly outside the building. I told the women working the front counter that there was a man following me and asked if they knew of any other exits/ways to get out of the park. At this point, my buzz is completely gone and replaced with cold apprehension. They directed me to a little side path that exited to a small side street, but it would quickly connect to the main street again, so I left through the back and went out that way. About halfway down this quiet, cobblestone road outside the park, I suddenly heard pounding feet, and then I was grabbed from behind and slapped so hard that I screamed and hit the ground. A couple walking together looked over, then kept walking. He yelled, "That's what you get for lying to me." Then, he ran off, breathing hard. I started crying and ran to the main street, then began speed walking through the crowd back in the direction of my hostel. I was terrified, but just kept walking faster and faster and faster. After a few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder and he was immediately behind me, walking in my footsteps. I almost threw up in panic and went into the first doorway I could find while he disappeared into the crowd. I begged the employees at the jewelry store to call the police, but they told me no, the police station was only a few blocks away and gave me really confusing directions. I asked the other customers if anyone would be willing to call the police because a man was chasing me, but everyone just ignored me. They asked me to leave, so I went outside and began walking again, but watched for streetcars. I walked casually for a few minutes, then just as a streetcar was pulling away, I leapt onto it and rode it back to the north part of the city. This was all really terrifying for me, being a chubby, awkward girl from a nice suburb. I have never really had to be afraid of strange men before. When I got off the train, I had no idea where I was and just sat down and cried. After maybe 15 minutes, though, a walking tour went by, and at the end of it were these two geeky, maybe 16-year-old, German boys who I'd met a few days before. They asked me to show them how a bong works at a cafe. They instantly recognized me and invited me to join the tour, which ended up being really fun. All in all, really terrifying afternoon, really fun evening. A few party poopers. I had a party at my apartment with my friends from college. We had music, beer pong, drinks, altogether a typical party. Pretty low-key. There was only about 12 of us, just looking for something to do on a Sunday night since we had the Monday off. We live in a complex that has a bunch of rows of townhomes and a huge parking lot. It was about 11:30 p.m., and there is a knock at the door. Figuring it was one of our neighbors, I opened the door. There was a very pale, skinny, bleach blonde girl standing there. She looked sickly, like a serious drug addict. She asked if any of us had a lighter, and my friend Nick gave her one. She walked into our apartment and lit her cigarette in our kitchen while everyone stood there silently and awkwardly watching her. She stood there for a minute, looking around, then abruptly said, "Thanks," and walked out the door. Our window was open, and we saw her walk down the steps to the parking lot and get in a car directly in front of our window, watching us. There was another girl and a guy in the car with her, equally sickly looking. We laughed it off, and the party went on. Every so often, however, we would look out the window and the same car would be there. The people always watching us. This carried on until about 1:30 a.m. when the three got out of their car and knocked on our door again. Nick opened it to see what the hell they wanted. He's an extremely intimidating looking guy, and the blonde girl said with virtually no expression, "We just wanted to know if we could come in. You guys look fun." Like beer pong fun. We politely declined, since it was late and people would be leaving soon, and she got irate and started screaming at us that we were idiots. We closed and locked the door. They walked back to their car and watched us again. Everyone started to leave around 2:30 a.m. The only people left were my roommate and I, two 20-year-old females. The car was still there, still watching. My roommate and I sat at the kitchen table, talking about what we should do, and the car started flashing their lights into our window, which went on for a few minutes. We shut the lights off and closed the blinds, but peeked through them to see what was going on. The car sat there for a few more minutes, then drove away. It was one of the most bizarre moments of my life. A stalker in the woods. I was out hunting in northern Ontario, with no roads, except for logging roads, for 130 kilometers. I was late on the bear season, so no one was out hunting in my quadrant. I found a nice campsite alongside a river and hunted from there. On the second day of my hunt, I came across the bear tracks. After tracking it for about 2 hours, I eventually turned back around. This is when SHT got very fkin weird. I always track on one side of the tracks and return on the other. About 200 meters down the east side of the tracks, I ran into another human footprint which disappeared across the trail and into the woods on the west. My dog, Czech wolf dog, didn't seem to smell anything. So I returned to camp with minimal concern. I got back to camp at around 7:30 at night, made a quick dinner, and had a cigar by the camp. At around 12 o'clock a.m., I heard a snap of a branch. After hunting for 20 years, I know only two things snap branches: bears and humans. I grabbed my firearm and a flashlight and went out after the noise. Every 100 yards, I would scan with the flashlight. My dog freaked, started growling, and advancing into the woods slowly. I pulled back on my leash to slow his advance and switched on my flashlight. I saw a pair of eyes looking right back at me. They stared for about 5 seconds and disappeared into the woods. On the walk back I felt anxious, scared, and uncomfortable, like I could feel someone watching me. The next night, the same thing happened. My dog went wild, like I have never seen him, whimpering, growling, and clearly very anxious. At this point I was terrified, and I didn't go hunting that day and didn't close my eyes once. That night I sat up with my flashlight, constantly scanning the tree line. I guess I dozed off at around 1 a.m. and woke again at 3 a.m., sweating, confused, and very scared. I scanned the forest, and just barely visible about 25 yards in the forest there was a man and his dog, looking right back at me. I started to approach him, shouting to him. I got within 10 feet, he looked awfully disheveled and malodorous. But the worst part was that he just stared and smiled, his eyes showed zero emotion, and he whispered, "Good night." I ran back to my tent, packed it into my pack and loaded it onto the trailer of the ATV, and drove out of there.